Baruch Hashem. Today's daf yomi is Menachos daf Ches, Menachos 8, and we're going to start on Zayin Beis, 3 lines from the bottom, where the Gemara told us on yesterday's daf Rabbi Elazar had said that if you put the blood that's in two separate utensils, that it's not miskadesh. It has to be collected in one utensil for the proper shear in order to make it kadosh. Mara asks on the bottom of Zainam Abayz, the Mi Amar Rebbe Lazar Hachi, does Rebbe Lazar really say this? Well, Imar, but didn't we learn about the Minchas Chavitim? That's the Mincha that the Kohen Gadol had to bring every single day. He brought half in the morning and half at night. But it says about this Minchas Chavitim, the Chavite Kohen Gadol, we learned Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Eina Kedusha L'Chatzayim. Rabbi Yochanan is in a position that you can't sanctify it half at a time, meaning to say that if you put half of an isaron in one utensil and the other half in the other, it's not going to be considered kadosh. You need a full isaron in one utensil at the outset. And so therefore it's going to be considered like a schulin and not kadosh. That's the position of Rabbi Yochanan. Whereas Rabbi Elazar is of the position, mitoch shekarva l'chatzayim, kedusha l'chatzayim. Since the minchas chavitin at the end of the day is going to be brought half in the morning and half at night by the Kohen Gadol, so it will eventually be split. And so since it will eventually be split, therefore you could sanctify it halfway. And so therefore, that's the concept that it is able to be sanctified halfway. So the Gemara says, and if Rebbe Lazar is of the position that you can't be Mekadesh the dam halfway, Vim Isa, Leilav Midam, or on top of Chasam and Aleph. Why doesn't Rebbe Lazar not learn out from blood? That just like it's not allowed by blood, it's also not allowed by the Minchas Chavitin. And if you want to say Rebbe Lazar in Milsa lo Gomer, if you want to say Rebbe Lazar doesn't learn out from blood to Menachos, but I'm a Rebbe Lazar, but doesn't Rebbe Lazar say Mincha shekamtza behechol? To Shera, that he says if you did the kamitza for the mincha in the sanctuary itself, it's kosher. And why is it kosher? Shekei matzino b'silot bezikin. And so, because we find by the removal of the bezikin from the trays of the lechem aponim that are on the frankincense, and there you remove it, and that's in the sanctuary. So we see from here that even inside the sanctuary, you could do the kamitza. So just like he learns out from the mincha of the bezikin to mincha kamitza in general, so too we should learn out from the dam to the mincha. And the Gemara gives the answer: no, mincha mi mincha yalav, mincha mi dam yalav. Yeah, Rabbi Elazar will learn out one mincha from another mincha, but he won't learn out mincha from blood. Gemara says, mincha mi mincha mi yalav. Does he really learn out mincha from another mincha? Vatanya, but we have another teaching in the Brisa. And this is the following: Achlo perka nifras lachma. That before, in the way the most Rishonim word this, before you, although not Rashi, before they removed the bezikin, right? Before they took the equivalent of the komets from the lechem upon him, from the bread in the sanctuary, nifras lachma. If the bread broke, then the lechem upon him, then a lechem pasul. Then the bread is disqualified because it's like a mincha that went missing before the kamitza. And we say later on, mina mincha pratla shechasra, to exclude a case where the mincha was missing before the kamitza. So, actual pirkut nifras lachma lechem pasul vein maktir lavas bezikin, and you're not allowed to bring those bezikin on it because it was disqualified. But misha parka, but if after you remove the bezikin, then nifras lachma, then the bread went missing. Halachem pasul, then the bread is disqualified. Umaktir lavasa bezikin, but you are allowed to still bring the ketoris because it went missing after you took the bezikin, not the ketoris, the equivalent of the kamitza. But I'm a Rebbe Lazar says, lo parka mamash doesn't mean you actually remove the bezikin. Al kivan shehigias mano lefrok. Since it became the time to remove the bezikin, it was a time where it was appropriate to remove the zikin, meaning after the middle of the day, it was after the 6 hours. Then afal pishal parka kamisha parka dami. Even though you didn't remove it, it was like it was removed. And I'll ask the Gemara the question, why is that the case? So the Gemara asks the case, why are you allowed to bring the bezikin after the bread was missing? Don't we say, didn't Rabbi Lezer compare it to lechem apanim? And the lechem apanim to the kamitza? And why don't we say it's like the halacha that if there was a mincha that was deficient before the kamitza, you can't burn the kamitza? Gemara says, oh, kasha. No, that's not going to be a difficulty. Why? Mincha or barar, the two cases are not the same. There's a clear distinction. A mincha will barar brira kometzidei. By the mincha, you're not able, meaning to say, why don't you compare the bezikin once it became the time for the bezikin? If we're looking at it as though it's removed, why don't we look at it as the equivalent, therefore, of a case of a mincha that went missing prior to the kamitza? Since it became the time to remove the bezikin, then even though you didn't remove it, it's like it was removed. But why? Why don't we say it's a mincha that went missing prior to the kamitza? So the Gemara says, no, there's a fundamental distinction between the regular kamitza and the removal of the bezikin. The regular, the kamitza is not separated from one another. And so therefore, so mincha obar breira kometzidei. But the bezikin is really separated, and so therefore, the kivan shegia is not command the parkadami. Since the bezikin was anyways separated, so therefore, even though it wasn't separated, once it came the time, it's as though it was already separated and did the kamitza. And so therefore, even if it became missing after the fact, you're not going to go back. It's not going to be it's not going to be disqualified. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, why don't we view it like the shirayim, the remnants that became missing between the kamitza and the aktara? They makdirin kometz that we said you don't bring the komets for them in that case. The Gemara says, no, that itself is a dispute. That's a dispute. Remember, Rebbe Lezer must hold like several command amar shirayim shachasru ben kamitza v'aktara makdir kometzalim. That in fact, Rebbe Lezer would allow you if the shirayim became missing between the kamitza and the aktara, he would allow you to bring the komets for them. So now the Gemara goes back to what we said at the beginning. The chavitim of the Kohen Gadol. Gufa chaviti Kohen Gadol. Rabbi Yochanan says ina kedusha l'chatzah, that you can't take this isaron and split it up. But at the outset, you first have to sanctify it as a full isaron, and then you could split it up, Rebbe Lezer Amar mitoch shekarva l'chatzah and kedusha l'chatzah. Rebbe Lezer says no, since it's eventually going to be brought in halves, so therefore you could sanctify it in a half. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Acha, my time with Rabbi Yochanan, what's the basis? Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Kra, it's based upon the fact that the pasuk says, Mincha machatzisa. It says in the pasuk in Parashas Tzav, it says, Mincha tamin machatzisa b'boker machatzisa be'er. So since it says Mincha machatzisa, it means heavy mincha, means first you bring the mincha, and then you divide it. So Meisvei, the Gemara challenges this, because we said Chavite Kohen Gadol lo ayu baos chatzon ela maybe isaron shoim v'chotzeo. It says you don't bring the Chavitim Kohen Gadol halfway, but first bring a full isaron and then split it up. So that's like Rabbi Yochanan. Betanya Yunemar, and the Brisa says if it had stated mincha machatzis. If it had said that language, I would have said maybe chatzis aron mi beso shachris umakriv and chatzis from beso aris umakriv. I would have said first he brings an isaron in the morning, and then another half at night. A half an isaron in the morning, and half an isaron at night. Tamor machatzisa baboker mechza mishalam hu mevi. Meaning to say that that it says machatzisa baboker, that he takes the half from the whole, and that's like Rabbi Yochanan, not like Rabbi Lezer. So the Gemara says. Gemara says, no, a mitzvah, that's the ideal, but it doesn't mean that if you did it halfway, that would be disqualified. Rabbi Lezer would also agree that the ideal is to bring a full isaron at the outset. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav, Gavia mibei kasil or Ravashi v'chuka ksiva. But doesn't it say chuka? And so therefore, since it says the word chuka, means to say that it has to be always whole, and that's ma'akiv, and that's the essential way to do it, like Rabbi Yochanan. So the Gemara says, "Amalei lo nitzracha el havi shalom shalom mibei." So that means to say that only teaches us that when in the morning when he comes, he has to bring a full isaron. But with respect to sanctification in the utensil, if he wants to, he could be sanctifying it halfway. Me, I'm Rabbi Yochanan Hachi. So the Gemara says, does Rabbi Yochanan really say you have to sanctify the whole thing at once, but you can't sanctify half of it? Me, I'm Rabbi Yochanan Hachi. Does Rabbi Yochanan really say this? Va'imar hifresh chatzi isaron v'dato ahosif. Let's say he separated half of an isaron, and then he intended to add on to it. Rav says, Eino Kadosh. Rav says that doesn't work. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kadosh. So we see Rabbi Yochanan doesn't say you need to do the full Yisraron. Maybe you could just do half. The Gemara says, V'misa leila from Chavitin. And if it's the case, Rabbi Yochanan should learn out from Chavitin that it doesn't work. Rabbi Yochanan milsa mi milsa lolio. If you want to say Rabbi Yochanan doesn't learn out the regular menachos from Chavitin, if you want to say that, the Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Shlomim sheshachtam behechal ksherin. Rabbi Yochanan taught that if you have a carbon shlomim that was slaughtered in the sanctuary itself, it's kosher because it says v'shachtu pesach ol moed shliyat tafel chamar meikar. That meaning to say that since the main thing is the sanctuary at the entrance to the sanctuary. In fact, and that courtyard is where it's usually slaughtered, but the ikar is the sanctuary. So of course, okay. So if that's the case, he should learn out from a regular mincha to minchas chavita, then it's okay. So Gemara says, no, there's a distinction in this case. Daito ahosif shani. He's always intending to add on to it. So therefore, to complete it. And so therefore, that case is distinct. That's why it's going to be kadosh. Gemara says, Vatanya, but really, is that the case? Detanya, Gemara says, Ben Yechusa, we learned in the price to support this. Malayim, it says by the Nisim that they have to bring complete flour as their offerings. A Malayim ela shleimim means to say they have to be complete. Amar Rabbi Yossi Amasai Bisman Shein Daito Ahosif Bisman Shedaito Ahosif Rishon Kodesh. Rabbi Yossi says, when does it need to be shleimim? Only when they are not intending to add. But when they're intending to add, each time you put it in, it's sanctified. The Rav, Gemara says, and Rav's position, who says that we just learned this dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Rav. Hold on one second. Where we just said it. Rav says it's not kadosh, that if you, even though you're intending to add on, it's not yet kadosh. But Amar, but Rav who says this, the Rav who says this, hold on. The Rav Bechavitin commands fearly, but Rav who says that by regular mincha, even though you're intending to add on, it's not kadosh. What does he say by the minchas chavitin? Does he hold like Rabbi Elazar that you could do it halfway, or does he hold by like Rabbi Yochanan needs to be the full thing? He commands fearly, Rabbi Elazar. If he holds like Rabbi Elazar that you could do it, he should allow it in this case. If you want to say Rav doesn't learn out one matter from another matter, Rav mincha could do below shemen. We know that the mincha itself, according to Rav, can be sanctified without the shemen and without the lavona. Because we see a similar case where the flour is sanctified by the lechem apanim below lavona without the frankincense. And excuse me, we find by the lechem apanim without the oil. The lechem apanim does have the frankincense, and we know Rav says the flour can be sanctified without the lavona. Shekei matzina b'minchas nesachim. The minchas nesachim doesn't have the frankincense. Below shemen below lavona. And we know it can be sanctified without the oil and without the lavona. So Rav, we clearly see, learns from one matter to another matter. So therefore, it must be al karchach Rav Rabbi Yochanan related. By Chavitin, he holds like Rabbi Yochanan, and that needs to entirely be sanctified all at once. But here he would say that it's not okay. And here also he would say it's not okay. Gemara says, Gufa Amarav Mincha Kedusha below Shemen. So now let's analyze this statement. Rav says a mincha can be sanctified without oil. Shekem Matzinu Belechem Aponim. We find this by the Lechem Aponim. And below Lavona, and it can be sanctified without the frankincense. Shekem Matzinu Beminchas Nesachim, because we find it by the Nesachim. Below Shemen and below Lavona, Shekem Matzinu Beminchas Chota. So the Gemara says, the Shemen Vilavona and Rav would also say that the Shemen and Vilavona, Kochi high, below high, they can each be sanctified on their own. Kochi high, below high, below high. Shemen, how do we know it's by the oil? We find by the oil of the Mitzorah that it's sanctified even without, just by itself. It's just the oil which is sprinkled towards the sanctuary and placed on the Bahonos of the Mitzorah. And the Lavona also can be sanctified on its own. The Lavona comes by itself with the Bezikin of the Lechem Aponim. Rabbi Chanina Amar, and Rabbi Chanina taught on the top of Ches Amabez. Rabbi Chanina taught, Lozu Kedusha Belozu, Vozu Kedusha Belozu. He says, no, each one, all of the Menachos that require oil and frankincense, the Kuisharis cannot be Mekadesh one of them unless all three of them are there together in the utensil. Well, Rabbi Chanina, if that's the case, according to Rabbi Chanina, that you need to sanctify all of them together, Isaron Lama Nimshach. Why is the Isaron that was in the temple, the measuring utensil, to measure the flour, how come it had to be anointed with oil to be sanctified? Because if we just held the flour, that was not enough to sanctify it. Gemara says, Minchas Chote, no, it does, because there was one time where you needed it for the mincha of the sinner. So, which was just flour. Also, the oil. Why was it? Why was the utensil that held the oil sanctified? Where it says for the oil of the mitzorah, which was also done brought by itself. V'av Shmuel Savra the Rav, and also Shmuel held like the position of Rav that they could be sanctified on their own. How do we see that? The Tanakh, because we learned in the Mishnah, Kuyalach Mekachin Esalach, a utensil that holds liquid can sanctify the liquid. Umidas Hayavesh Mekachin Esayavesh. And the utensil that holds dry things, the measuring things for dry in the temple, to be Mekadesh, the dry things. Main kliyalach mekachin esayavesh, and the utensil for liquids can. This is from the Mishnah's Nachem, cannot be mekadesh to dry. Midos hayavesh, and the measuring things for dry cannot be mekadesh esalach. Va'amar Shmuel, and Shmuel taught about this. Loshna el midos. When do we say this? By the measurings. By the measuring utensils, we say this. Says Shmuel. By the measuring utensils of the liquid, because they only sanctify via measuring, and you only measure in them the moist things. But mizrakos, but the bowls that hold the blood, mikachos esayavish, they can sanctify the dry. Shenemar shneim leim, so it's b'lua b'shem l'mecha, because you wouldn't mix in the flour with the oil in them, and they would. And so therefore, so we see that the solas, which is something that's dry, was placed there and is sanctified in the bowl to receive the blood. So Gemara says, "Amalei Ravachami Dipta or Ravina." What are you talking about? Well, how is that a verse? Mincha lachahi, the mincha of the Nisim, and he learned it out from the pasuk Shneim Leim Solas B'Lua B'Shem Mincha. So from the mincha of the Nisim that was placed in there. So the Gemara says, but that was moist. Mincha lachahi, Amalei Lo Nitzracha. No, it was taught. No, that there were dry elements in it that were not yet mixed in. Or else the mincha vis-a-vis the blood was not as moist, so it was considered like it was dry. So Rebbe Lazar says the mincha that they did at Kmitza from in the sanctuary is kosher. Because we find by the removal of the bezikin that it was also in the temple. And so that was the equivalent of the komets. The bezikin removal by the lechem aponim was the equivalent of the komets by a mincha. So the Gemara says, Rav Yirmiyah challenges this from the fact that it says "V'kamatz misham." It says in the pasuk, "V'kamatz misham," and we learned out from that, uh, and we learned in the Brisa from that the makom sheragli as our omdos that you do the kamitza from where the non-kawanim stand, i.e., in 11 amos to the east of the Azar. B'Meseira Omer in the 11 amos of the eastern 11 amos of the Zara, whereas Ben Masera says, Minayachim kamatz but small sheyachzer let's be men. Ben Masera uses this pasuk to teach us something else, which is not directly relevant, because it says, so he teaches us that you put it back in, which we had 2 days ago. So that was a question Rabbi Yirmiyah said, because doesn't it show that you could do the kmitza anywhere, but not in the sanctuary, only in the Azara? Ikeda Amri, who most of what Mefakos, some say he asked it and he answered it. Ikeda Amri, Amri Rav Yaakov Rav Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa az bracha. So some say Rav Yaakov bar said to Rav Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa, I'll explain it to you. Lo nitzacha lahachshir is ko azara kula. And on that pasuk, Kamat Visham is saying you can do the kamitza in the entire Azara. Shalot Tomar, that you shouldn't say Hol va'ola kachi kachim, mincha kachi kachim. That since the ola is the kachi kachim and mincha is kachi kachim, that you might have thought ma'ola tu'una tzafo and mincha tu'una tzafo. You might have thought they both require the north. So therefore, don't say that. The Gemara says, why would you think that Mala Ola Shekain Kalil, the Ola is entirely burnt? Well, maybe from the Chatas. Chatas. Mala Chatas Shekain Mechaper Salchayvik Krisus. You wouldn't think Torah from the Chatas. Chatas atones for Karis penalties. Me Hashem. Well, you wouldn't think Torah from Hashem. Mala Hashem Shekain Mini Damim. Hashem is always a lot of blood offerings. Mikulu, so not me. Shekain Mini Damim. You can't learn from all of them together because they're all blood. So why would you need the pasuk? Sokadai Techamina. You might have thought, oh, v'ksiv, v'krivel, kohen, v'gisha, mizbeach, v'kamatz. That since it says about the mincha, the kohen brings it to the altar and does the. So you might have thought, gisha v'karen trumas, just like the agasha of the mincha has to touch the southwestern corner of the altar. Af kamitza nami b'karen trumas ma'aravis. I might have thought that the kamitza also has to take place there, and we know that the zar cannot get there, and so therefore kamash malon is teaching us that you can do the kmitza anywhere in the courtyard. So, okay, we'll stop here. Baruch Hashem. Stop the recording right here.